I now welcome representatives from the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you for appearing before the committee today.
Thank you.
I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the grounds upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Such a request may also be made at any other time. Questions on notice will need to come back to us by the 10th of January. Before I ask you to make an opening statement for the record, could we just get both of your names and the capacity in which you appear?
Emilie Dye, Policy Director.
Brian Marlow, I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Taxpayers Alliance.
Great, welcome to you both. And would one or both of you care to make an opening statement?
Yes, I would like to give an opening statement. I'd like to thank the Chairman, Deputy Chairman, and members of the committee for giving me this opportunity to present on the proposed Currency Bill 2019 on behalf of the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. The Australian Taxpayers Alliance is the nation's largest grassroots advocacy group representing taxpayers. We are funded by civic-minded Australians passionate about lowering taxes, rolling back inefficient and ineffective regulation, and bringing an end to government waste. We choose to address policy issues based on public outcry from our supporters. The proposed restrictions on the use of cash would impact every Australian's freedom of choice in how they conduct transactions with their own money. It would infringe on the privacy of law-abiding citizens who should have a right to make purchases without the government or big banks looking over their shoulders. And it panders to corporatism by forcing individuals by law to use the services of big banks. The proposed restrictions do not impede crime, terrorism, or tax evasion. We should never forget laws impact law-abiding citizens more than lawless criminals. Some may argue that only a few people regularly withdraw $10,000 in cash, so supposedly only a few people would be impacted by a $10,000 cash threshold. But because of inflation, this threshold would encroach on all Australians. In 1 year, assuming inflation remains consistent, the threshold would effectively drop to $9,800. In 10 years, the threshold would be approximately $2,000 lower than what is currently being proposed. Meanwhile, KPMG is already proposing we legislate a lower threshold. And a 2017 report from the Black Economy Task Force admitted they aren't yet calling for a complete abolition of cash. This bill would impact the lives of everyday Australians, either now or in the future. While the bill does exempt individual-to-individual transactions, like buying a car, it sets a precedent of government overregulation of cash transactions and the cash economy. Australians deserve a right to privacy. In the modern world, data is a commodity. The entire business model of multinational corporations like Facebook and Google is based on people selling their data, admittedly often for less than it's worth, for products like an easy means of sharing pictures and connecting with friends. By restricting cash, the government is forcing people to give away data about their purchasing habits for free. This plays right into the corporate hands of banks. All individual Australians can do is hope their purchasing data, conveniently recorded on credit and debit cards, isn't sold, accidentally leaked, or otherwise used against them. In addition to the invasion of privacy, this policy would gift the big four banks a whole new customer base, all tied up with ribbon for Christmas. The banks could then charge more fees, they could lower interest rates, provide poor service, and neglect to innovate because demand for their service has been forced to increase, while supply has remained constant. Monopolies and oligopolies always harm consumers, especially when the corporations involved have been propped up by protectionistic legislation. Australia's Royal Commission has revealed a long backlog of dubious behavior, such as banks charging for advisory services they never intended to provide, and knowingly charging fees to dead customers. The Australian government should not reward them or enable this kind of behavior by forcing all Australians onto bank cards and taking away the option to use cash. Many will argue undermining criminals and illegal behavior is worth the cost of these restrictions. But in reality, cash restrictions will do little to reduce crime and instead treat law-abiding citizens like criminals that cannot be trusted with privacy. Businesses are already required to disclose large cash transactions to the Australian Transactions Reports and Analysis Centre, or AUSTRAC. And criminals who are already breaking the law to launder money or avoid taxes will just as readily break this law. Money launderers already use untraceable cash and would be undeterred by this new law. The European Commission concluded in 2018, and I quote, "Restrictions on payments in cash would not significantly prevent terrorism financing." As for tax fraud, generally, large multinational corporations engage in tax avoidance and sometimes evasion by using legal and tax experts to take advantage of loopholes in the tax code. This is rarely done with briefcases full of money. Tax evasion with cash does happen, but most often with small amounts of cash at a time. For example, a restaurant failing to declare profits on meals purchased with cash. Only a total cash ban would impact this kind of tax fraud. And such a move would harm the 37% of Australians who still regularly use cash, as well as the other 63% who enjoy better services from banks because of competition. In conclusion, a ban on cash transactions above $10,000 would hurt all Australians by giving more power to corporate banks, infringing on privacy, and taking away the freedom to choose how to conduct transactions. It would do little to deter crime and fraud while costing Australians dearly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So have you, Ms. Dye, have you had much communication from your membership about this issue?
Yes, people have reached out and been quite outraged.
Okay. So can you give us a sense of, the sort of businesses perhaps that have been reaching out to you, the sort of issues that have been raised?
If I could potentially jump in there. So one of the campaigns we run is a campaign around vape shops that exist in Australia, and they're actually an example of what the previous... vape shops, electronic cigarettes.
Yep.
And they're an actual example of what the previous attendees spoke about, which is companies that are legal and operating within a legal framework that are being affected by banks not wanting to allow them to use their payment processing services and having to rely on cash transactions or even cryptocurrency. So you have about 200 to 300 vape shops in Australia. They spoke about other, adult stores and things like that would be affected by this. And I've had vape shop owners contact me to say, look, this cash ban bill would actually restrict my ability to purchase, bulk products because I use cash because payment processors won't work with me. Even though they're a legal entity in Australia and a legal business with an ABN and an ACN, and they pay their taxes and they're registered for GST.
You're saying the banks won't deal with them?
Yeah, so essentially there are a lot of banks that will not allow them to use their card terminals or transaction services and will not allow them to bank with them. So they'll use like a third-party payment processor, say like PayPal or Stripe, but even those payment processors are now turning around and saying, actually, we're not going to allow you to use our services. So they now rely on cash and they rely on potentially cryptocurrency or other payment processors that may not necessarily operate within the same frameworks.
Is that because they just don't like vaping?
Essentially.
Okay.
But the issue is that if the government...
So what about Smoke Mart? They're still going?
Yeah, so tobacconists are still going, and that's totally fine. Banks are happy to work with companies that sell products that kill 2 and 3 long-term users. Yet, for some reason, this is just a small subset of an example, but it is an example of shops that have contacted us to say, look, this is something that could affect my business, and they're legal businesses.
Do you have any sense of the scale? I'm sure Treasury will be able to fill us in on the numbers, but do you have any sense of in terms of your membership, how many are still reliant on cash transactions to be a significant part of their business? I mean, we all have heard the story that in our everyday lives now we've very rarely got cash on hand, a lot of us.
Well, 37% of Australians still regularly use cash. A lot of those are business owners, and a lot of those are large transactions. Businesses regularly deal with $10,000 in cash, whether I'm a farm. I grew up on a farm. It's like combine costs tons of money, and just renting it costs over $10,000. Just the header costs over $10,000. And a lot of people prefer cash. They don't like the fees associated with banks. And so this is a good alternative for them.
You mentioned at the start of your submission about the value of the $10,000 over time. What is that, based on inflation? Or?
Based on inflation, I estimated 1.9% inflation over the next 10 years. It's a rough estimate, obviously. But yes, it would drop significantly.
So the legislation just locks in the 10,000 and that's it forever?
It's not capped to inflation.
It's not capped.
It's not tied to inflation. So essentially, longer term, your real dollar figures essentially drop. It's a slow squeeze, and I don't think it's personally a mistake. I think it's a feature, not a bug, of this legislation.
The example earlier was that, there's probably not a great incentive for a business that's buying some farm machinery or whatever for cash to avoid the GST because they have input and output credits. And you need to balance them together to get the true benefit. So is there any evidence that that's not working or people are stepping right outside that?
I don't think so. I don't think there's evidence that just because of cash people, there are evading taxes and evading GST. That's what audits are for, and there are laws in place to avoid this kind of thing. Businesses do have to report large cash transactions, and so with something like $10,000, they aren't going to be cheating on their taxes, and if they are, they'll get caught.
And why would you just worry about GST? If you're going to avoid tax, you avoid it all, wouldn't you? If you're going to
Yes.
Exactly.
You just step right outside the system and away you go.
And there are alternatives like cryptocurrencies. People, if they want to go undercover, they can. And people who are criminals and do evade taxes and do commit fraud already know these nefarious means. They know how to use untraceable cash. And this law really won't impact them to the same extent it will impact small businesses. So
if someone's come by their money from sort of ill-gotten gains, they'd step into the taxation system to make it all legal, wouldn't they? They'd happily pay GST and company tax and all the rest of it because then it would all be, transparent and clear.
Senator, essentially what you're talking about is money laundering. So you get money through illicit ways and you set up a front company to then clean that money, run it through the tax system and essentially make it all hunky-dory. Now, there's audits in place to try and highlight that and it does get exposed. But yes, that's correct.
I've been told that the tipper industry in New South Wales, particularly in Sydney, is a rampant place for money laundering, but it's a good industry to go into because it's high fuel costs, high maintenance costs, and you've got to buy a truck. And people are laundering millions of drug money and probably working on Badgerys Creek, moving mountains of soil. So does this take into account, would this fix any of that?
No, I don't believe so.
What would it fix, this bill?
This bill affects primarily small businesses and people that are trying to operate legally. It's forcing them onto banks and making them pay fees that they might be trying to avoid. Bank fees, not their taxes. They're trying to pay their taxes. They have legal businesses and they want to be above board. But this legislation would negatively affect them.
Senator, from our perspective, what it would fix is the big banks' inability to attract new customers, as well as potentially increase the tax pool of the government. Now, one thing I want to highlight is that the Liberal Party's We Believe statement talks about being the party of small business and the party of, avoiding burdensome regulation for individuals. This flies in the face of that. It creates burdensome regulations for small businesses that are already struggling, that are already having to comply with all kinds of regulatory burdens. And Senator Patrick highlighted that larger corporations essentially can skirt around those issues and avoid these sorts of things. And this actually benefits many of those larger corporations by forcing everyday people to transact with them, specifically banks.
ExxonMobil being one of them.
Yes.
Okay, $42 billion, no tax paid.
Exactly.
Absolutely unfathomable. So,
What do you say about the penalties in respect to this? If this becomes law, is that an unusual penalty? 120 penalty points and 2 years jail. I mean, does the punishment fit the crime here?
No, I would say that's egregious. There are already penalties in place for tax evasion. There are already penalties in place for not paying taxes. The idea that we heard previously about payments essentially also being linked. So as you highlighted, if someone pays $5,000 for a product through a company and then a few $1,000s a couple of days later, the idea that they would then potentially be fined or lose their business license or their ABN, that's, for me personally, the mind boggles. I don't understand how that's acceptable.
And small businesses, a lot of these people, they're not experts in law, but a lot of these bigger corporations, they are. They've got legal experts that can make sure that they don't break the law and accidentally incur these fees. And even if they did, a bigger business, it's not going to impact them nearly as much. Smaller business, it does.
Who do you think would police this law? Or how do you think it would be policed?
I think the banks would do a lot of the policing in many ways. Wouldn't let you withdraw $10,000, would be wary, would ask questions.
That's not what the experience is with Westpac.
That's correct. Well, look, I mean, essentially in terms of what government entities, it would most likely be auditors from the ATO. However, they've already got the power to audit companies, and companies have to have receipts for the transactions that they make. Now, sure, there will always be a subset of people out there that are trying to minimise their taxes and reduce the...
Fairly large subset, I'd imagine.
Yes, but we already have the tools in place to try and ensure that people are doing the right thing. This doesn't actually solve the issues that it purports to solve, which is, illicit trade and crime and things like that. From our perspective and from a lot of our supporters' perspective, all it does is employ a corporatist model that benefits a select few banks and potentially increases the tax take for the government.
And has the ATO or Treasury interacted with your organisation and explained the justification or the rationale or the evidence or logic for this?
No.
No. The European Commission has done research on this specific topic, and they found that it didn't impact terrorism, it didn't having a cash ban, didn't affect money laundering, didn't affect tax fraud. It really didn't do any of the things that it was purported to do.
We had an interesting submission from the funeral directors who said that there are groups in the community who, well, for whatever reason, they keep a bit of money under the bed and like to pay for their funeral with cash. Is that have they indicated to your organisation or anybody else that that's an issue?
Funeral directors haven't, but anecdotally, there are numerous examples you can point to. So a good example that we were discussing is, you want to buy an engagement ring for your partner, and you don't want her or him to find the actual transaction because you want it to be a surprise. You go to a jeweler, you pay them in cash. There are always going to be examples of scenarios in which you don't want to go through a payment process in order to do these things. Now, there's a potential that by passing this law that more people will use cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency isn't really that fungible for someone who runs a jeweler or something like that. All you're doing is limiting potential customers for them or limiting potential trade and creating more of a regulatory burden for them.
Thanks, Chair.
I just go to one example because I'm not... So the vape shops that you're talking about,
Yes.
I mean, what transactions are they actually doing above $10,000?
So it would be like purchasing. So essentially, you have shops that sell the products, but then you have manufacturers, and there are manufacturers in Australia, and they'll buy.
There are manufacturers in Australia
that produce liquids. That's correct. So the liquids that go into a vape, there are manufacturers that produce those liquids. So shops will buy that in bulk. Now the issue is that it hasn't happened with every vape shop, but a lot of vape shops are now finding that the big banks will not allow them to use their services. And separate to that, payment processors are now like Stripe and PayPal and other payment processors are saying actually we're not going to allow you to use our services, so they have to rely on cash.
So are there any other categories of goods that you feel fall into this?
In Victoria, I know that legal sex work operations found that they weren't able to trade with certain banking providers and things like that. I don't have exact examples, and I can take it on notice and send that to the committee.
Yeah.
But you're talking about companies that are in a regulatory grey area, where, from a bank's perspective and a payment processor's perspective, they take the view that yes, these products are legal now, they may not be in the future. There's a bit of a hodgepodge.
There's a question of legitimacy.
Yeah, correct. So they take a step back. And the issue is that if a law passes that says, oh, look, any transactions over $10,000, you can't do it, it's not going to work. It's going to shut them down.
Then becomes, where would these businesses go if the bank doesn't want them? The legislation comes in. What happens to them?
Well, they'd either cease to exist, or they would use cryptocurrency.
Sorry, and just because I think it is important to be clear, sometimes people talk about the banks and they're just talking about the big four.
Yes.
And sometimes they're talking about the broader banking sector. Because, obviously there are a lot of smaller banks who do work with small businesses and...
Yeah, so
mutuals.
the feedback I've had from vape shop owners is even smaller banks are now not working with them. And it's not happening to every single vape shop. Again, it's something that started happening and is now slowly spreading. So payment processors are now starting to not work with vape shops. The big four banks are not necessarily working with vape shops in every single case. And some of it just falls on the fact that they get a bank account, they start transacting through that bank, and then later on, the bank does an audit and goes, oh, actually, your business doesn't meet our criteria, so we're no longer going to let you use our services. Same with payment processors. So there are examples, a specific example, there's a vape shop in Victoria called Victory Vape. They use a payment processor called Stripe. My understanding is that Stripe did an audit later on and essentially turned around and said, actually, no, you don't fall into the categories of companies that we will allow on our payment platform.
Can I get you to take a question on notice?
Of course.
Can you give me actual examples of where a business believes they would be blocked from doing something?
Sure,
'Cause
absolutely.
I think we're hearing a lot of, potential, but I would like some actual examples.
I can get you an actual example.
Senator Patrick.
Yeah, thank you. I just wouldn't mind exploring a little bit more about enforcement and how that works or doesn't work, and how that interlaces with current restrictions in law. So, in some sense, I was talking with the previous witness. If you engage in transactions as a business and you don't report them, you're committing a breach anyway, aren't you?
Yeah.
That's correct.
Whichever way you do that. So if you're not putting it on your books, and one presumes if you're using cash transactions for illegal purposes, you don't then put it in at least the ledger that the tax office might see. How do you actually catch someone conducting business in cash when presumably there's two willing participants in the cash model?
Yeah, this would be through audits. And
But how does an audit catch that?
That is a good question. And I think this is part of the reason why it's not very effective in catching crime. People that are criminals and are using these cash transactions to evade law enforcement, they're going to keep doing that. This isn't going to affect them.
And we also live in an age where a lot of illicit transactions are done through cryptocurrency and on encrypted messaging apps like Telegram. If I want to purchase illicit substances, or if I want to purchase something that I shouldn't have access to legally, I would just get an encrypted messenger service and then use a Bitcoin wallet or another cryptocurrency to do that. This won't solve that.
But whilst you talk about Bitcoin being used for illicit purposes, in actual fact, Bitcoin can be used for very legitimate purposes, and I just wonder whether or not you're aware of any businesses that are moving towards a Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency model. I've certainly seen shops that advertise they accept Bitcoin.
Yes, this could actually make Bitcoin more stable in many ways by pushing more businesses onto it. I know a lot of online businesses accept Bitcoin. I can't think of a specific business off the top of my head, but I've definitely seen that.
There's hypotheticals in that. I do know that there are some international, again, vape shops and other companies that accept Bitcoin. There was a political party called the Liberal Democratic Party. For a while, they accepted donations through Bitcoin. So, those are examples. A registered political party that, former Senator Leyonhjelm's political party used to accept Bitcoin donations. Mm-hmm. Those are examples. I'm happy to take that on notice and find other examples of companies that accept Bitcoin payments. And
yeah, I'd love to understand that. And I take your point. I have about maybe 300 journalists' phone numbers on in my mobile phone, and I've also got Signal and WhatsApp. And I noticed since the AFP raids that took place in June, the May-June, the number of journalists that have gone onto Signal has increased dramatically. And they're
Exponentially, yeah.
all
Yes.
legitimate, absolutely ethical journalists. In fact, they're being driven onto those encrypted platforms because they ethically feel an obligation to protect their sources. And I just wonder if indeed this bill would have the effect of driving people to cryptocurrencies more quickly and for absolutely legitimate purposes.
Yeah, I mean, whenever governments crack down in certain areas, you always get some form of flight. An example, I went to Hong Kong for the pro-democracy protest. I met a group of people out there. I met journalists out there who were all using Telegram to communicate with each other. And yeah, over here as well, journalists that I speak to now use Telegram and Signal, just because even if it's for just a general discussion, they'd rather use that than potentially be open to having the AFP come and raid their headquarters.
A lot of individuals are beginning to distrust a lot of these big corporations that have done shitty things, and they don't want their data leaked and their messages leaked, however innocent they may be. Like, they can have perfectly legitimate transactions, completely legitimate conversations, but they don't want that leaked.
And are you sort of in the space where you understand how much a business might pay for transaction service? Like, I know when I ran my own business, the charges I received for my personal account versus the charges I received for my business account, the business account fees were higher.
Yes.
So, in some sense, if you go off to places and start using things like cryptocurrency where those fees are not charged, and obviously there's risk in the currency fluctuations, but it goes to your point about driving people towards banks that then charge fees, which in most instances can be adjusted at the whim of the bank.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
This would help banks. That's who this bill most benefits. They can charge higher fees. They can get away with it because now they have more customers, and those customers are forced to use their services.
And in respect of those fees, I don't know if you've done any analysis on those fees. Do you think those fees reflect the true cost to a bank of a transaction?
It's no a business transaction through my business account versus a transaction through my personal account. I can't see how it would incur any additional costs for unfortunately, I'm with Westpac and looking to leave. Within our office, all of our business transactions and our business accounts attract much higher fees than our personal accounts. I can't think of a specific figure off the top of my head, but I'm happy to.
So whatever the customer will bear is often the saying in the commercial world.
Yeah, and if you're forced to bear it as well, well then, like if you have no other option, you're just going to pay whatever the bank deems charges. As soon as you reduce supply.
Exactly. So an increase in demand for banks and a decrease, and the supply remains constant. So automatically the price will go up.
What's the figure for AUSTRAC's transactions in terms of where they get notified? Do you know what that is?
I do not know. I can take that on notice.
No, take it. AUSTRAC are coming, so I just thought you might have known that. I might also point out AUSTRAC did not make a submission to this inquiry, which almost seems astonishing, actually. It's like the government didn't rally the troops properly. How do you convince senators to vote for something that even the people who are most likely to benefit, being AUSTRAC and the tax office, don't bother to make a submission? Just I find that unbelievable. But I presume AUSTRAC, with my understanding of cryptocurrencies, would not be in a position to track transactions internationally through cryptocurrency.
That's correct.
That's correct?
That's correct. And a lot of people that use cryptocurrencies also use a VPN. So you're adding an extra layer of anonymity.
Sure. And once again, there are legitimate reasons for not using banks in those transactions, because you do get charged a fee just for the international transaction service and indeed for currency exchange, and that's something that Bitcoin avoids completely.
Yeah, I think that sort of goes to a wider point, which is a lot of the discussion in the media around this cash ban is an almost idea that it's illegitimate to transact cash over $10,000 as if no one would do that. We disagree with that. It is a legal tender and it's legal currency, and we don't think that anyone's doing anything morally wrong by purchasing products, between two consenting individuals over a certain value.
The Small Business Ombudsman said, gave an example of a legitimate cash transaction over $10,000. Your submission didn't really go to that. Have you got any sort of list of examples of legitimate business transactions other than the
on notice?
I thought you were talking about entities that have been debanked.
No.
My understanding
Examples.
is that Senator Brockman
examples.
wanted examples of companies either potentially that would say that we'd be affected by this, or companies that...
So examples of $10,000 plus transactions that would be...
Legitimate. Okay, so we're after the same thing.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very
Can I
much.
just ask one question before you go? So, aged pensioner, there's a deeming rate on their modest level of savings, and that deeming rate is in excess of the actual earning rate. So they actually go to their bank each week or each fortnight and take out whatever available cash there is, so that they don't trigger a higher deeming rate and a lower pension. That's not illegal, is it?
We don't believe so.
I don't
You
believe
just
so,
take
no.
your money out of the bank. You can...
Nope. And
So
elderly
you-
people do generally use cash more than the average.
Exactly. So a lot of people are doing that.
There's nothing in this legislation that stops people
No,
taking
no,
cash out.
no,
of
but
the
I'll
bank.
get to the point. So they do that for a number of years and they end up with $15,000 in cash and they want to pay for their funeral. Will that be illegal under this legislation?
If it's to a business, yes.
Yeah.
So,
Now,
so the unintended consequence is people are taking $200 a week or fortnight out over 2, 3 or 5 years. I actually know people that do this.
My mother's doing this.
Exactly. So they end up with money under the bed and they say, look, I'm going to kick the bucket, pay for the funeral. That's now going to be illegal. Nods don't get on the handshake.
Yes.
So
Yes,
yes.
That is correct.
Yes, that would be illegal.
Yes.
All right, we will need to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time today, and we'll just pause briefly while we get the New South Wales Farmers Association on teleconference.